Hi, this is Dan Siegel, author of the book Aware and the book Mind and the Developing Mind, and you're listening to The Soul of Life.
I'm Keith Miller. I bring together people who are interested in slowing down to understand how the mind works and how we can live in greater connection to one another in a fast-paced, stressful world. This is The Soul of Life. Hey everyone, welcome back to The Soul of Life. I'm Keith Miller. Today my guest is Norma Stevens. She's the director of the therapy program over at Sunstone Therapeutics. And Sunstone doesn't do just ordinary psychotherapy. They do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, just like our clinic, Calliope Health. And they're just down the street from us in Rockville, Maryland. So I thought I'd reach out to Norma, who's an old colleague. We share an IFS background. And I think you'll get a great sense of what it's like to work in this emerging field of psychedelic assisted therapy by hearing us both talk about our experiences with these medicines. Sunstone works with a wide range of up-and-coming, soon-to-be-approved psychedelics like 5-MeO-DMT, LSD, and of course psilocybin. They work in partnership with the Acquilino Cancer Center, so they've been embedded in the community doing research and allowing people to get into the studies to use psychedelics through research programs. And Acquilino Cancer Center, of course, works with people struggling with the diagnosis of their cancer and possibly end-of-life types of treatment. So I think you'll get a lot from this interview with Norma. Thanks for listening. I'm here with Norma Stevens, and I'm excited to talk with Norma because she is the therapist at Sunstone Therapies. She's the lead therapist of operations there, in fact. And we're going to talk about all that Sunstone does, how it overlaps with what I do at Calliope and the psychedelic world. So Norma, welcome to The Soul of Life. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Keith.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, where should we start? I mean, there's so many things to talk about. There's so many interesting things that Sunstone's doing, that you're doing, that you've been involved in, and cutting edge things, news developments as it relates to psychedelics in the medicine space. Tell us a little bit about why you got into this work, and that might lead us into what Sunstone does a little bit more.
Yeah, great. Thank you. As you know, Keith, I'm an IFS therapist, internal family systems, and you introduced me to this model back in 2010 with a 30-minute talk that really resonated with me. And so I immersed myself in the model. And then in 2014, I went to the annual conference an IFS annual conference with Michael Mithofer was the keynote speaker, and he showed us videos of the work he was doing with PTSD veterans, and I was just mesmerized. But in 2014, there was no avenue for me to do that kind of work, and I kind of put it out of my mind until 2019, when I had an opportunity to get trained at MAPS, at that time the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and now called Lykos. But at that time, and there was a few therapists and I that wanted to go to the training, but in order to do that, we had to have a doctor on board on the team. So we heard about some doctor in Bethesda that is interested in psychedelics. So we went to speak to Dr. Manish Agrawal and his administrator, Kim Roddy. And after an hour conversation, they said, sure, we'll sponsor you. Because they were in the middle of building the first psychedelic assisted therapy space, in a community center. And they said, we don't know how MDMA will work here, because they were mostly doing cancer. They were going to start doing cancer research with psilocybin. But anyway, they just said, come on board. We said, all right, here we go. And it's just ballooned from there. I started working at the center part-time in 2020, and I ended up leaving my practice back in 2022 because I've just loved this work, and I love the team that I'm working with at Sunstone. And we've had some incredible studies that we're working on, and Maybe towards the end I could do a list, because we are going to be recruiting for people to participate in these studies, and it's just been a wonderful opportunity. But what Sunstone represents is trying to solve the problem of how do we deliver these medicines in a safe, ethical manner that also is economical enough to provide enough access to different people. And it's a real tension. And that's really what we're set out to do. And so in the last couple of years, we've been working on a program under Lykos called Expanded Access. And what that means is when MDMA became a breakthrough therapy several years ago, the FDA gave Lykos, MAPS at the time, but now Lykos, the permission or the approval of a program called Expanded Access, which means, no, it's not legal yet, but we're going to expand the access to this treatment for people who really nothing else is working. And we had 50 slots in that program. Sunstone will end up treating 45 to 47 of those slots. And it's one of the first places where we're doing it in a community setting. And that's been highly rewarding. We're in the middle of it. It's been so rewarding. But there's also, there's a lot I have to say about psychedelic medicine.
Beckley PsyTech, that's different than Beckley Retreats.
Yes.
They're working on 5-MeO-DMT. We can talk more about that. You work with Compass Pathways, MindMed, MAPS, which you mentioned is now Lykos Therapeutics, Reunion Neuroscience, and Usona. And the medicines, the psychedelic medicines that your group works with are MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, and 5-MeO-DMT, which is different than DMT.
So far.
So far, yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But what stands out, I guess, you mentioned the work in the community. What does that mean exactly? Is it a public clinic or is it open? Like, how do you define community?
Yes, I see what you're saying. Okay. So it's in a local, our facility is in a local cancer center. And it started that way because they were building the center initially to do research with psilocybin and cancer, patients with cancer and depression.
And this is the Acquilino Cancer Center in Rockville, Maryland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But as we were doing this, so as we finished that study, we realized that all of us had to sort of quit our full-time jobs, basically, to come together. And Manish and Kim founded Sunstone, and so we created. It's sort of a medical practice, but right now, all we're allowed to do is research because none of these are legal at this point. And we wanted to try to answer the questions of what does it mean to do this in a community. And one of the things that we're doing, like, for example, our cancer study, we've had an integration group going on for 3 years for the people that have completed the cancer study. And now we have another cancer, that was like a feasibility study that we did initially. Now we're in phase 2. And for your listeners who may not understand some of this jargon, there's like a feasibility pilot, phase 1, then there's phase 2. And then if the data looks good in a phase 2 clinical trial, it goes to phase 3. And at that point, after the phase 3 data is submitted, then the FDA looks at it and decides whether this can be commercially available, the medications. And this is sort of a basic, very basic drug, how the drugs work. I mean, the FDA drug approval process works.
Sure.
So we have a phase 2 study now, and we are feeding that integration group with new people all the time. And so I know Manish's vision is to have a community center where eventually, as these become legal, we can have people come through our treatment. then start up in integration groups, and then maybe even, I mean, we don't know yet because we're not there yet, but maybe even iterate more where we have people that have graduated all the integration and the study or the treatment, then maybe they could provide peer support. And we want to build a community around Sunstone eventually. But right now we're in the research phase and we're learning. We're learning a lot about screening and about who's appropriate, not appropriate, what happens, what kind of things you need to have in place to keep people safe. So that's what I mean by, and so eventually we will be a clinic. As soon as MDMA hopefully is approved, we'll be able to provide that treatment because we've got everything already set up and ready to go.
And when
Does
do you
that
think?
make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's amazing. I've heard that MDMA will be approved. That the FDA announced that it will change its status in August, and then the DEA
Yes.
has 90 days to reschedule it as a drug that's available for medicine.
Yes, there's a lot that needs to happen. So hopefully the FDA, that's what they've said, that they will hopefully give us that approval in August. And then the FDA has to reschedule it, as well as some of the state legislators. Some states don't automatically accept the FDA. They have to do their own process. So it really probably wouldn't be available commercially till they're talking first quarter 2025.
Right, right. And so Lykos owns the patent on that MDMA molecule that they engineered for FDA approval. Do you anticipate any hurdles or pitfalls for how expensive it's going to be? I know the FDA version of ketamine, which we do in our clinic, is called Spravato, and that's about $800 or $900 per dose because it's the particular molecule that was engineered for the FDA approval. Most clinics, including ours, don't use the on-schedule version of ketamine. We use the off-label version, which is a common practice in medicine. But it does, I just wonder if people are going to be using off-label MDMA.
I don't know yet.
Right. Because who knows how much it's going to cost.
Yeah. And some of the biggest costs are the therapists.
Yeah, the time.
And the time. And, there are forces out there or actors in our field that do not want or are minimizing the role of therapist or, trying to take psilocybin and get it down to a magic pill.
Yeah.
Okay. Or a pill, I should say.
Yeah, something shorter acting. I know I was listening to a podcast the other day on science versus, and they were talking about DMT actually, which is very different than 5-MeO DMT. But DMT has about a 10 or 15 minute trip, which is as significant, most people say, as an LSD trip or an MDMA trip, which can be 6 to 8 hours. So that's interesting. I know logistically in our clinic, it is a person power issue with hours, like with ketamine is so discreet in that way because it's short acting. After an hour of a pretty high or medium dose of ketamine, people are in recovery very rapidly and able to speak and talk and do therapy. So walk us through a little bit what the difference is between something like ketamine, which is available, and many of my listeners will have some experience with this, versus an MDMA assisted therapy or a psilocybin assisted or LSD.
Of course, I'm talking anecdotally because we don't have any data, but my experience is with ketamine is that it's highly, highly effective. I shouldn't say it. I think it can be very heart-opening and help people get to where they need to go.
Yeah.
But it's at shorter spaces. So I would think when people may need, once a week for a month and then go, and spread it out more, through the year. I'm sure you have your treatment protocols.
Yeah, it's usually months and ongoing for a while until the results
For a while.
stick. Yeah.
And, I've been reading, I read posts and things in the field, and people, you might be treating someone for a year, and that's not bad. Yep. It gets to where you need to go.
Life changing, yeah.
But what I've seen with MDMA especially. Psilocybin, I have seen drastic changes as well, but in the trials that I've been with psilocybin, it's just a one treatment trial. I do wonder what would happen if we had like 3 treatments once a month or something.
Mm-hmm.
But with MDMA, my experience has been, again, this is totally anecdotally, but about once a month for 3 months, seems to really get to people where they need to go. And it goes, those 6 to 8 hour trips for MDMA are very, very deep. And they get to a lot of material in one treatment session.
Yeah.
And by the end, not everyone, but a lot of folks, you will see drastic reductions in their scales that they measure PTSD. However, the issue with research is it doesn't really always capture all of the story. It gets outcomes and the symptomology and all that is reduced, and some people don't meet the clinical diagnosis anymore and those kinds of things. But such a broader picture and richer picture of what these medicines can do for people's lives. So I wouldn't say one is better than the other. It's just a different way of working.
Yeah,
and they're both very powerful.
They're really different tools in the tool shed. One's more like a hammer, one's more of a screwdriver. They're all interesting in their own ways and can be used in different ways. Can you give an idea? Like, can you illustrate any examples of the dramatic shift that people often report? And I certainly could go down the list of talking about examples. Obviously, we have to change some details for anonymity's sake, but could you describe a little, like, what are the things that have just made your jaw kind of hit the floor? You've been a therapist for a long time, so have I. We both know that with PTSD or childhood trauma, therapy is measured in years and progress is measured in maybe half a dozen years at a time. And so what is the difference with the tools that you have, psychedelic tools?
I will see people, I've seen people come in with the trauma that I started working with veterans, and I had never had that experience before. These people have seen horror, trauma that we can't even as civilians imagine.
Yeah, for real.
And to see them come in and they are just feeling, just broken. They have survived suffering that I can't even really relay to you, the horror that they've watched. And to see them come in so down, they're not sleeping for months. They're not sleeping.
Which is devastating. That
devastating.
Alone is a devastating condition to not sleep.
That's torture. After maybe one MDMA session, they're able to sleep again.
Wow.
After the second MDMA session, they're getting to not only the trauma of being in the armed forces and being in combat, but then they're getting into their childhood trauma and making connections, and it is unbelievable to watch. And then by the third, they're feeling more like themselves. They have a clarity. They can feel how they can fit into this society again. Their relationships are gonna, I'm not saying they come out perfect. They still have to work and they have to integrate. And so, but their relationships are shifting. Their reactivity is down. There's not horror rages going on at home. Just a lot of things like that.
Much more stability and
much
a sense
more
of
stability.
Peace in the body and trust for the body again.
It's like you can't put money on how important that is in the quality of life.
Yeah.
And I've seen things similar with psilocybin. Just a few. We just had one pilot study on psilocybin with PTSD. So we only saw I think 4 people. So it was really and it was part of a larger study, but it was still small because they're doing the feasibility until they can go to the next level. But we were surprised at what we saw, even with one psilocybin session with PTSD, and I was nervous. I was like, oh, I don't know about, because psilocybin with MDMA, you're more present, and for any IFS folks out there, parts just come up naturally and organically, and it's really beautiful work. But with psilocybin, people can almost be out of their body, like you're not really you can't do any work in terms of therapy at that time. You're just supporting them through the experience. And some people came out doing well.
Can I jump in? I want to ask you something that a lot of people ask me, and I'm just curious how you answer it. People who are, there's different subtypes of people, right? And I'll put myself into the category of a former dare to keep kids off drugs. I had a, sort of puritanical halo, I like to say, around my head as a religious person when I was very young, about never doing any drugs, never taking substances. And so there's some people like that, and like me, which I needed some convincing, and needed to have a real need for it, and then some convincing. And other people who've tried lots of different things, and they're like, yeah, we've got nothing to lose, or this is going to be great, no matter what, and they're willing to try. How do you address fears and concerns of those parts of people? We call them managers in IFS, managers that are saying, I don't know about this. I'm going to lose control. Or the therapist referring to us is afraid that their client is going to be overwhelmed with their parts, or overwhelmed with the experience, or they're, lose touch with reality, right?
Yeah.
And so obviously careful
Yeah.
screening is part of that. We don't give this to everyone, depending on their level of stability on a psychotic spectrum, right? It's something we don't play around with. But how do you address those concerns?
Well, as far as I get the hesitancy towards drugs, because you're going to laugh. 35 years ago, I was working at the Department of Justice, and then I went on to work with the National District Attorneys Association and I hate to say it, my salary was probably part of the funds of the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. Yep. And so it was a big shift for me to be looking at these. This is, back in 2018, 19. It was I had to go through a big shift. But the way I see them now is, if you look at the history of these medicines, all the research on LSD and psilocybin back in the 60s and 70s, they were starting to have good results with cancer, end of life, even alcoholism.
Yeah, alcoholism was one of the biggest motivations for these medicines, because they were dramatically effective.
Yes.
Which is counterintuitive when you think, oh, this person is at risk for substance abuse, and we certainly debate this and need to have a hard conversation about this with ketamine, any of these drugs actually. How are they getting them outside of what we're giving them? And are they willing to report that to us and have a relationship with their use of these medicines? Anyway.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that's important too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then when I realized, and I really looked at the history, and I looked at the history of war on drugs, and I'm like, oh my, this was a political decision, a very thoughtful and intentional political decision to shut down the hippies, or the people that were protesting Vietnam, and
anti-war.
Also,
yeah.
Yep, and it was also racism.
Yeah.
It was racism and making drugs. Anyway, so when I saw all that, and that all this research was not shut down because there were good results.
Yep.
It was not a research decision.
That's
that
right.
made me step back. And also, we use morphine. We use morphine in the hospital all the time, every day.
And these are far safer drugs than morphine
Exactly.
or
And I'm
coke.
not going to
Yeah,
give morphine to somebody to go party with,
right.
but it has its uses.
Mhm.
And I think that psychedelics need to be respected for what they are. They're extremely powerful. And with anything that, whether it's sex, money, the internet, anything powerful has incredible positive transformation potential and also equally potential for harm.
For sure.
And so we need to be very, very intentional and careful with these medicines and respect them and put them in settings that are where people can get this safely. And as far as the addiction potential, MDMA and psilocybin are very low on the addiction. I have this great graphic. I wish if we could see it, but anyway.
Yeah, what's that called? I've seen that. That's like the scale of toxicity, and they list things
Yes, by David
like
Nutt. And it's
coffee and
alcohol
caffeine,
is number one harm
so neurotoxic.
to people and others. Number
Yeah,
one.
number
And
one.
psilocybin, MDMA are all very low. And the only one that is seen as some addiction, more addiction potential is the ketamine.
Mhm.
But even that is more in a recreational setting.
Yeah,
But you know what? I could see it being a problem if it's not carefully, if doctors aren't careful with it, right? Because we've heard horror stories about benzodiazepines and all kinds
that's
of
right.
other opiates and all kinds of other medicines that have gone astray. So it's really how we use them.
Yeah, I don't want to be caught saying it couldn't happen to us. Those of us who are promoting and encouraging people to use that it couldn't happen, that overuse couldn't happen, or over prescription or I like to say I'm not an enthusiast of psychedelics. I'm a workshop person, and it's one of my tools. It's just a boring tool. I mean, it's not a boring tool, right? But like from a
It is, it's
professional,
a tool.
it's a tool. It's just a tool.
It's
And
just a tool. It is
yeah,
not like one thing I often find myself doing in prep sessions is sitting down with people with their expectations. You know, they saw this documentary, they read this book, or they watched this television show. You know, I'm going to take this magic pill and I'm going to
hmm
get better, right?
yeah,
And
it's
it's
not
like,
magic.
it's not magic.
No,
Let me tell you.
it reveals the work that you have to do, and begins to give you remove some of the fear and shame around that work. But you still got the work.
I mean, what can get very intense in MDMA psilocybin sessions are the intensity of this work, because imagine a person's coming in, they've spent years, their system has spent years, they might not even be conscious, years protecting them from certain things and knowings because their system feels they can't handle it. And it is all opened up in a day, or maybe two, one or two treatment sessions.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
There was one story I want to relate, that a person came in for treatment, ketamine treatment, after the first session, went home, and this is later I heard about this from that person's partner, who called up and said, "I've never heard this person all of a sudden just started talking about things that I've never heard them talk about." And it was like this sort of like, I didn't know that was going to happen. And it was so opening and helpful that they said, "I'd like to come in and I now see the benefit and I trust this. I'd like to,
Yeah.
I could benefit from that."
Yeah. I mean, I know my gut was when I went to get the MAPS training, I had never had a psychedelic. I think I was the only person in the room of 50 people who had never done it. But I had this intuition, very deep, knowing this is something. This is going to help me help people that I haven't been able to help before. And I have seen it. And I've seen it not go well.
Tell me about that. Let's talk about that because I think it's important.
It is really important. I think the screening is really key. I think it's absolutely essential. There has to be medical screenings because some of these medicines have cardiac risks. It's like exercising, MDMA or psilocybin. It's like, your heart rate will go up and your blood pressure might go up a bit.
Yeah.
Just like you are hard exercising, but if people have any underlying cardiac problems, that could be a big problem. And there's some other indications where that wouldn't be good. And then if people aren't in a stable place in their life, if they're not in a stable housing, they're not in a stable family place, if they're not able to, I've been working with this a little bit in my own mind. I've been thinking about this lately. I just started writing a little bit. I see people that come in and if they can't regulate just in normal everyday life, it feels to me like, and this is anecdotal, I have no research, these are just some of my thoughts, that giving them a psychedelic doesn't quite make sense because now you're opening them up to even farther and they might not be resourced enough internally or externally to handle that.
Yeah, I've seen it both ways. I see that potential risk, but I've also seen people who are dysregulated and nothing is working to get them into
Yeah.
a pattern. So the decision is made around, well, we need to try something. So sometimes it's still worth justifying, but yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, some people come in, I'm thinking, oh boy, oh no, and then they do beautifully. I totally get that. So this is the art of trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
And when I say dysregulating, I don't mean just a little. I'm talking really extreme dysregulation. But still,
Yeah.
it's a lot to hold. Honestly, that's been some of the hardest part of this work for me is figuring out who can I feel comfortable giving this treatment to and who may not be the best. And I've been wrong on both sides. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's a practice. We're practicing and learning. And so there's a lot of humility, I think, that comes with it, in my opinion.
yes. And everything I'm saying today on April 23rd, you could talk to me 6 months from now and I'll be like, no, I didn't know what I was talking about back then. I've learned so much more. I mean, it's just constant.
Yeah. Yeah. I got a couple of questions. One is, trials are not for everybody. They're not easy to get in. They're not necessarily reliable. And so some people, if they really need treatment, they're applying for a trial, they may not get it. How do you does Sunstone offer anything other than the trials and research, or they're not allowed to?
Well, we're not doing that yet just because these medicines aren't available. And we just haven't, we're only honestly like 3 years old. So we've just built the infrastructure to do the research, but eventually we do want to do ketamine and other things because like when I was thinking about like a case where someone is really dysregulated, I prefer doing maybe ketamine first to give them that opportunity. It's a little shorter acting before we go to some of the others. Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing is we're trying to figure out, and we don't know which medication would be better in which case.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, they're all a little bit different.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the kind of LSD that Sunstone is using in the trials, or has used, or is going to use. I know the FDA announced a breakthrough status to, I forget what the name of the company is that's creating
MindMed.
It's creating a form of LSD that will be allowed for.
It'll be it's breakthrough status for LSD for generalized anxiety for right now.
And is Sunstone working with that with MindMed?
We were part of the first pilot study, and we treated 2 people on that study, 12 to 14 hour journeys.
Yeah, they're intensive.
They're very long, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we're going to be part of the next iteration or not, but
right.
Yeah.
Right. You mentioned people having expectations. I know Michael Pollan has had a huge impact. People don't know Michael Pollan, he's probably where you should start, or a really great place to start with learning about psychedelics, because this is a person who was not a pro drug at all, or pro psychedelics at all, but he was a food reporter, food journalist and writer. And eventually he had maybe, I think, some personal reasons to explore, and he was willing to talk about psychedelics and all the research he did. And so I call it the pollinization of the world. Like, people have it's had an effect. His journalism has been...
It's definitely had an effect. I read his book back in 2018-19 when I was trying to figure out whether to do this work or not.
Yeah.
And it was very helpful.
Yeah. It has an impact on providers. Just him being able to tell the narrative of moral opinion and how that influences why do we tolerate and permit alcohol to be everywhere when it is actually the most dangerous and one of the most neurotoxic drugs. I'm gonna read a quote from Tom Bissell, actually, who wrote soon after Michael Pollan wrote How to Change Your Mind. Tom Bissell's a journalist for the New York Times. I'm just going to read this quote and then we can talk about it. Tom Bissell says, "Well, why does anyone take drugs? The simple answer is that drugs are generally fun to take until they aren't. But psychedelics are different. They don't drape you in marijuana's gauzy haze or imbue you with cocaine's wintry, italicized focus. They're nothing like opioids, which balance the human body on a knife's edge between pleasure and death. Psychedelics are to drugs what the pyramids are to architecture: majestic, ancient, and a little frightening. Pollan persuasively argues that our anxieties are misplaced when it comes to psychedelics, most of which are non-addictive. They also fail to produce what Pollan calls the physiological noise of other psychoactive drugs. All things considered, LSD is probably less harmful to the human body than Diet Dr. Pepper." So, your thoughts?
Well, there's some truth in what he says. It is kind of ironic. And actually, some people are using cannabis now as part of therapy. It says it's a heart opener, so that's interesting.
Right. I've seen people doing psychedelic doses of cannabis, which apparently are pretty high.
But again, it's really, to me, it's all about the delivery. Set and setting. I know it's going to sound like a cliche, but it is absolutely critical.
Can I ask you about...
Sure.
Sorry to jump, but so music is one of the kind of common denominators in, I think, a lot of these guided journeys for the set. Or the setting, rather. Have you had people just opt out of music, and what are the results? How is it different? How do people respond with music in some of the medicines that you've worked with versus without?
It's more nuanced than that. It's music is meant to, especially like in you're in other realms of consciousness. It's a nice tether to hold on to as you're going down the journey.
Yeah.
If the music, sometimes the music will start evoking some challenging feelings, issues, thoughts, whatever. Sometimes we may invite at first to be with that music for a moment, to see what it's evoking in you, because that might be a place you need to work. On the other hand, the music can also take you out of the journey.
Yeah.
Some people will just sit and listen to the beautiful music, which will prevent them from going deeper. Or some people, it's just they've got a system that's really focused, and this is taking them out.
Yeah.
So what's important to me is to really listen to the person I'm working with in the moment. And so when they say, I have had people say that we start the music and in the beginning and they're like, Norma, I'm telling you, this is taking me out. I say, okay. And we shut it. Well, we shut it off. And they go in and they do their stuff. And then maybe at the end of the day, we'll bring it back up as they're coming back into the room. And just, it's kind of a nice soft entrance. But I've had other people where the music was absolutely crucial. It's like the third therapist in the room.
It really is. Ketamine, especially, it makes a huge difference. The music evokes so much, and without it, there's still interesting things that happen, but not nearly as interesting.
It just depends. If they're asking because they don't want the music because it's evoking and that's making them nervous, or it's more of like an avoidance kind of thing, then we want to try to gently work through that. But if it's taking them out of where they need to be going, that's what we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Yeah, it's one of those. It depends, right?
But that means that the therapist has to really be attuned, right? And not come in with that agenda. Mm-hmm. This is so different from some of our talk therapies and people who prescribe meds. This is a very different paradigm. This is a place where we come and we hold sacred space for these folks, and we, with love and compassion and openness, and we help guide them and listen to them, what they need, because it's very much like IFS, right? It's client-centered. We just go with because we trust that their system knows what to do. We just need to facilitate it. And then when parts come in, or aspects of themselves that want to avoid or suppress, then we try to help them with that. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. Yeah.
And some of these sessions for therapists, I do want to say a few things to therapists who are interested in coming in this field. It is not an option, self-care. It is not a cliche. These are so intense. You cannot go into an 8-hour session depleted, because it won't be good for you. It won't be good for the person you're working with. Doing your own work is another. Now, I know in IFS community, that's like, we do that naturally because that's how we've all been trained. It's not so in everywhere else. And people need to understand you've got to be able to go within your own deep traumas so that you can sit with the person in theirs.
Right.
Because otherwise your parts are going to get in the way. And these are such intimate, powerful experiences for the therapist that we have stuff coming up all the time. So, one therapist I know, I love her. She writes down, and I've started doing this too, write down something that's coming up for you so you can just put it away and say, I'll come back to you because I got to be present here. And then you need to be, I don't mean to sound directive, but I would encourage people very highly to be in some kind of either therapy themselves, minimum once a month, or retreats or meditations or meditation groups, supervision, all those things to keep yourself open, because we are a big part of this experience too.
Right.
It's the synergy between the therapy and the molecule, and the person's system.
You're not doing it alone. There's an attachment piece to it, which is so important. Are there any projects you're working on now that you'd like people to know about, and how can people get engaged?
Yeah, because we have some studies open that I think could be some people may have interest in. We have a phase 2 study to evaluate the efficacy and safety of psilocybin in adults with major depression and cancer. This is a lovely study because it's done in groups of 4. So we have, during the treatment, they're each in their own room during the treatment, but then they come together for preparation and integration in their groups. And they also have individual preparation and integration. So it's really a very interesting study. And what I like about this is it is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, but there's up to 2 doses. So if you have not responded to the first dose, you won't know whether it's a placebo or psilocybin. You will get psilocybin in the second dose. So I really like that. We also have what we call an MDMA assisted therapy dyad study. And what that means is we are providing MDMA assisted therapy for adjustment disorder in pairs of patients with cancer and a concerned significant other. It's such a, cancer patients have so much suffering, but their caregivers do too. And so that's been a really interesting study to be working on. And so we are recruiting for that. We also have a couple of studies for psilocybin therapy for major depression. We have just in general. And we have one we're screening now for, as we had spoken before about the treatment-resistant depression study with using 5-MeO-DMT, and it'll be in an intranasal form. And so we're really excited about that study as well. It's pretty early. It's a study that's pretty early for 5-MeO-DMT. There hasn't been a lot of research in it, so really excited about that.
That's great. Well, thanks for this opportunity to just kind of get a behind the scenes tour, a little bit of what a therapist does, who's assisting people with psychedelics. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I'm going to encourage people to find the Sunstone Therapeutics on the web, check out the different opportunities to get involved and the research that's being put out. I think for physicians especially and people in the medicine field, I think that's where you can understand the most about what's going on with these interventions.
Yep.
Thank you, Norma. Great to talk with you today.
Nice to talk to you too, Keith.
I like it, and it's not harsh to my eardrum.
All right, I will go.